a debate transpired in Spain in 1550 over the rights to enslave the native peoples in the newly conquered lands, including Mexico, under the Encomienda system. And now, let's better understand with the help of the In Our Time podcast.
In 1550, at royal command, two sides met in Valladolid, in Spain, to debate the future of slavery in the new Spanish colonies in the Americas. One, following Aristotle, argued that native people were natural slaves who went with the land and should stay slaves. The other argued that others might be slaves, but these were Spanish subjects and should be treated as equals. This defender of Native American rights was Bartolomé de Las Casas, and some say he was one of the first proponents of human rights anywhere. So what would you say the legacy of this 1550-51 debate was?
Because the texts that we're talking about, Democratus Alta, and some of the texts also of Las Casas, weren't actually published during this time. I think the legacy has been, in many ways, a delayed legacy, because actually some of the reportings of these, that what's happening in the council, of the Valladolid Council, aren't even being reported back to the Council of Castile at this time. And so, in many ways, it's being discovered later when people are looking at these texts, also in the 19th century. And it's at this point that you have, in the 19th century, also the likes of independence leaders like Simón Bolívar talk about the importance of Las Casas as the first defender of Latin American rights, for example. And then later on, in the 20th century, you have the theology of liberation movement takes up Las Casas as a defender of the rights of the Amerindians, and many of the rights centres in Latin America today are named after Las Casas.
Was there any sense of improvement of the condition of the Native Americans after this?
Not really, I'm afraid. The new laws do give the scope for Indigenous people to challenge their treatment. They're actually reissued in a watered-down version that allows encomiendas to survive for 2 generations in the first instance in 1552. So you do get some more protections for Indigenous people. And as I said, you do continue to have Indigenous councils and Indigenous nobles, and in some cases groups of commoners or ordinary people petitioning within this structure that Julia talked about. But they're aware that there are ways of petitioning, ways of getting to the crown and getting to authority. And the Aztec people, or the former Aztec people, actually get into that really quickly because they had a big petitioning legal system. So they quite quickly adapt to the Spanish legal system and start getting involved with it. But I wouldn't say that anything changed as a result of the Valladolid debates at all specifically, though there are incremental shifts in what people can do legally all across that period.
Was there a sense that the idea of this battle between what is a slave and who is not a slave and who is a half slave and who is a natural slave, did that feed into an ongoing argument?
I think it does, definitely. And into the debate as we tend to know it from much more recent times. Yes, I think it does. And I think another thing about long-term influence, which we've been saying takes a while to get going after the debate, is that Las Casas' portrayal of the behavior of the colonists, particularly, for example, in his Brevísima Relación, his short account of the destruction of the Indies, as he calls it, is it does begin to develop something that was already going on in Europe, a black legend about Spanish society and its behavior abroad. And this applies as much in Europe as it does in America. But what's interesting from our point of view is, of course, that instantly the potential rival imperial powers in Europe take this stuff up. It's absolute gift to the French, to the Dutch, later to the English, to show that the Spanish are in fact misgovernors. And so in that sense, it has a great influence, I think.
Well, just to add to this devastation of the Indies that Bartolomé de las Casas writes, it gets illustrated by Theodore de Bry, and this creates this imagery of the excessive violence of the Spanish Empire. And in fact, the British Empire uses that as legitimation for incursions into the Spanish Empire in the north by saying it's liberating the Amerindians from the excessive violence of the Spanish.
And I think it's very easy in these debates to make it all about Europeans talking about Indigenous people and blur them out. And I tried, because that's obviously what I'm interested in, the agency of Indigenous people, to try and sketch them back in a little bit. But because it's also theoretical and so top down, it can be very difficult to see them being an influence in these debates until you start recognising the way in which the different issues overlap. And the problem is that Valladolid is an exemplar of lots of things that are going on, isn't it? So Las Casas is appearing not just petitioning in the Valladolid debates, but he's appearing as an expert witness on behalf of Indigenous people who would like to be freed, testifying that they're speaking Mexican languages. He writes a big, absolutely excoriating petition on behalf of a Mexica who is imprisoned for his part in the Mixton revolt, and he's campaigning on his behalf in Spain. All of these kinds of things are going on at the same time, and they overlap and feed into those debates.
Just to add to that, I think it's important to see Las Casas in many ways a tip of an iceberg of this system of petitioning, which in effect is coming from all over the Spanish Empire, and that is driving legislative change in a way that you see the empire is being responsive. Okay, we can question how important law is in this sense of, is law then regulating violence in the way that it's responding to the petitions? But there's a sense that marginalised voices could be heard, and that was part of the way that the Spanish Empire was conducting itself, part of the way that we can think of the constitutional mandate of the Spanish Empire, how it's thinking about its own validity.
There's a sort of intellectual basis for all this discourse, both sides in that debate. Aristotle, again, mediated usually until the Renaissance period, throughout the Middle Ages, through the work of theologians, particularly, of course, Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian. But with the Renaissance and the return to the original text, to the sources, then you've got a different line. But they've got a common discourse. Also, I think a lot of it is about intellectual method. The other thing about the Dominicans, like Las Casas' order in this period, is the fact that Thomist scholarship, this is scholasticism of Aquinas, particularly the University of Salamanca, but in others as well, was immensely powerful and dynamic and developing. It was affecting the way in which the Catholic Church tried to sort itself out in the Council of Trent, and it was to do with these imperial disputes that we've been talking about. The fact that this was, as it were, the language which you used.
It's tempting to set up Sepulveda and Aristotle and natural slavery against Las Casas, but actually Las Casas doesn't reject Aristotelian theory. And he tries to defend Indigenous people based on Aristotelian theory and the idea that they fulfill all of Aristotle's criteria for the good life. And he doesn't reject natural slavery either. He simply argues that it is a category that is limited to a very few people. It's not a category you can apply to a group of people, is Las Casas's argument.
But his methodologies are also interesting because he, on the one hand, is trained as a lawyer and he's thinking about the arguments of Aquinas and so on. Very heterodox in his approach because he's bringing in the experience of living in Hispaniola and his more heterodox approach to Thomism that in many ways he's been left out from many of the intellectual histories that have focused on, for example, Francisco de Vitoria and his essay on the Indies, because it's more orthodox in a way.
The Dominican order was split over a number of things in this period among itself. There were bitter conflicts. So Las Casas had his friends and his enemies in the order. He had some allies, but the whole thing was in flux. And I do think this is part of the whole crisis of the Reformation and the Council of Trent. Catholicism was having to re-examine itself. You could almost do this as a sort of subsection of that.
The councillors that were part of the Valladolid debate, in fact, two of them were dispatched to the Council of Trent, and that was what caused the delay in the verdict of the outcome.
We didn't mention that there wasn't a verdict. In fact, Las Casas is widely regarded to have won because he won the propaganda war. His materials were widely published afterwards and widely circulated where Sepulveda's were largely suppressed. And of course, they fit much more neatly with modern ideas from the 18th century forwards about human rights and so on. So he's seen to have won, but both of them claim to have won.
It's fascinating power play, isn't it, between the church and the state, and you wonder how much they overlapped and who really believed in what, and then the third element being them over there getting on with it one way or another and not getting on with it. So you have at least a triangle.
Although I didn't actually see it that much as church versus state. I agreed with everything you said, but much of the pressure for Indigenous rights, for want of a better word, comes from the crown via the church. So people like Las Casas petition the crown, but then it's the crown that implements those laws. There's perhaps because of their sense of mission as the Catholic monarchs, which is a title given to them by the Pope. The Spanish crown may be partly a legitimating tool, it's a kind of front, but they also are very possessed of a sense of mission. In 1492, they not only encounter the Americas, they also complete the Reconquista from the Moors, and also they expel all of the Jewish people from their realms or force them to convert. So there's a real religious fervour, and you actually see people saying things like, well, God has given us these new lands to convert, now we've finished with the ones in Spain, so we're ready to go to the Americas.
We've also got to bear in mind all the time that the Spanish Church was almost independent by this time, by papal grant. The patronage of the New World was granted. Charles V actually got it done. The appointments of all the bishops and so on are basically done by the crown. In many ways, though one must not, of course, make the mistake of saying they're the same, it is pretty much what Henry VIII aimed to do with the English Church at the same time. France and Spain effectively were running national Catholic churches in this period. So in that sense, you can't separate the two, it seems to me.
You're absolutely right. Then there's the big distinction between the missionary orders and the secular church, the priests, who sometimes overlap and sometimes don't. So Las Casas is both a secular priest and a missionary.
But Las Casas' reputation has more than lingered on. It's held steady and even grown, hasn't it?
I would say it's been revamped in the 20th century, especially by the way that it's used by the theology liberation movement. Gustave Gutierrez, who writes this notable book about Las Casas as standing in solidarity with the poor and the first defender of the rights of the Amerindians. And in the wake of this movement, you then have these human rights centres in, for example, Chiapas, where Las Casas was the bishop, being established in the name of Las Casas.
And actually, there's been a recent resurgence of interest in the debates themselves and Sepulveda versus Las Casas in relation to just war. So you've had a group of mostly legal scholars start to talk about whether Sepulveda and Las Casas' arguments about the extent to which it's just to go to war to impose your beliefs on another culture, can that be applied to the extent to which it's just to go to war to impose democracy? There's actually been a real resurgence of interest who have written on that question and actually revamped these arguments and these ideas and said, is there something we can learn here about where the edge of our civilization is? What's the limits of our tolerance?
And also interventionism, the fact that they think that they're saving people from sacrifice or saving people from their crimes against nature, effectively. So this kind of long history of interventionism. And it's Enrique Dussel who describes Sepulveda as the father of modern philosophy, in that he creates a framework for the subordination of some people over others.
I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.